Imagine this. You're drowning. The water is freezing, your lungs are burning, and you're thrashing around trying to keep your head above the surface. Suddenly a guy on a yacht pulls up. He smiles, leans over the railing and throws you an anchor. "Grab on," he shouts, "this will save you." Desperate, you grab it. And guess what? You sink faster. That, in a nutshell, is the relationship between the World Bank and the African continent. Most of us grow up thinking the World Bank is this benevolent charity, a global Santa Claus with a calculator, handing out cash to build schools and dig wells. But if you look at the ledger, a terrifying reality emerges. For decades, more money has flowed out of the global south to Western banks than has flowed in as aid. We are talking about a system designed not to end poverty, but to manage it. A system where the solution is actually the problem. Today we are doing a deep dive. No scuba gear required, but maybe bring a stiff drink. We are going to uncover how a financial institution created to rebuild Europe became the architect of Africa's economic nightmare. Welcome to the debt trap. 1. The Bretton Woods Betrayal. To understand how we got here, we have to hop in our DeLorean and travel back to July 1944. The setting isn't a boardroom in New York or London. It's a swanky hotel called the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The Second World War is still raging, but the Allies know they're going to win. So 730 delegates from 44 nations gather to decide what the global economy is going to look like once the dust settles. It was basically the Avengers Assemble of economics, but with more tweed suits and fewer superpowers. Now, who was at this table? The United States, the UK, the Soviet Union, briefly. France, you get the picture. Who wasn't at the table? Almost all of Africa. Why? Because in 1944, most of Africa was still coloured in pink, blue or green on the map, denoting which European power owned it. Africa wasn't a diner at the restaurant. Africa was on the menu. The few independent nations like Ethiopia, Liberia and Egypt were there, but they were essentially muted by the big players. The conference was dominated by two massive egos. In one corner, you had the legendary British economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was the genius who understood that if you crush a country with debt, like Germany after WWI, you get chaos and guys with funny moustaches starting wars. He proposed a global currency called the Bancor and a clearing union that would penalise countries for having too much surplus and countries with too much debt. It was a system designed for balance. In the other corner you had Harry Dexter White, the American representative. White didn't care about balance. He cared about American dominance. The US held most of the world's gold at that time. They were the economic juggernaut. White wanted a system based on the US dollar, controlled by the US. Guess who won? Spoiler alert, it wasn't the guy trying to be fair. The result was the creation of two institutions, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which we now know as the World Bank. From day one, the game was rigged. Unlike the United Nations, where, theoretically, every country gets one vote, the World Bank operates on a $1 one vote system. Your voting power is determined by your financial contribution. This meant the United States effectively bought veto power over every major decision. It's like a homeowners association where the guy with the biggest house gets to decide if you're allowed to paint your front door, and also he owns your front door. To this day, the president of the World Bank is always an American, nominated by the US president. It's an unwritten rule that has never been broken. So the World Bank was born with a specific mission: reconstruction. Specifically, the reconstruction of Europe. The first massive loans went to France, the Netherlands, Denmark. And it worked. It helped rebuild a shattered continent. But by the late 1950s and early 1960s, Europe was back on its feet. The bank had a lot of capital, a lot of staff, and a business model that required lending money to survive. They needed new clients. Conveniently, this was exactly when the winds of change were blowing across Africa. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania. Flags were being raised, anthems were being sung, and the colonial powers were packing their bags, but keeping the keys to the safe, which we'll get to later. These new nations were eager to modernise. They wanted dams, highways, power plants, and universities. They wanted to catch up to the West in a single generation. Enter the World Bank smiling like a used car salesman who just rolled back the odometer on a '98 Civic. You want development, they said. We've got the cash, low interest, long terms, just sign here. It seemed like a dream. But there was a catch. Several catches, actually. First, these loans were often made in foreign currencies, usually US dollars. This is a critical detail called original sin in economics. If your local currency crashes, your debt effectively doubles or triples overnight because you still owe the same amount of dollars. You're betting your entire economy that your currency will stay strong against the dollar. That's a risky bet even for wealthy nations. For a fledgling economy, it's Russian roulette. Second, the bank's philosophy in those early years, especially under the presidency of Robert McNamara. Yes, the same guy who managed the Vietnam War, because when you think helping people, you definitely think Vietnam War architect, was focused on massive capital-intensive infrastructure. McNamara took over the bank in 1968 and ran it like the Pentagon. He was obsessed with numbers, targets, and moving money out the door. He famously told his staff, "I don't care how you do it, just get the money out." Why is this bad? Because it encouraged lending for the sake of lending. Loan officers were rewarded for the volume of loans they processed, not the quality of the projects. It was the subprime mortgage crisis, but on a global scale. They pushed complex projects on newly independent governments that didn't yet have the administrative capacity to manage them. They funded dams that displaced thousands of people and barely produced electricity. They funded roads that led to nowhere. But here is the darkest part of the Bretton Woods legacy, the Cold War context. We cannot talk about the World Bank in the 60s and 70s without talking about the Soviet Union. The US was terrified that these new African nations would turn to communism. The World Bank became a tool of foreign policy. If a dictator was pro-American and anti-communist, the World Bank taps flowed wide open. It didn't matter if he was stealing the money, it didn't matter if he was torturing his people, as long as he voted with the West at the UN and kept the Soviets out, the checks cleared. This established a culture of odious debt, loans given to oppressive regimes that the people of the country never benefited from, yet are still forced to repay today. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the trap was set. African nations were hooked on cheap credit, the global economy was booming, commodity prices like copper, cocoa and coffee were high, and everyone thought the party would last forever. But the Bretton Woods system had a flaw. It assumed the global economy would always be stable. It wasn't built for a shock. And in 1973 and again in 1979, the oil crises hit. The global economy tanked. Interest rates in the US skyrocketed thanks to the Volcker shock, we'll get there. Suddenly those low-interest loans weren't so low. The variable interest rates exploded. The cost of repaying the debt jumped, while the price of the stuff African countries sold, commodities, crashed. The trap snapped shut. The World Bank, which had presented itself as a partner in development, suddenly changed its tune. They weren't the friendly banker anymore. They were the repo man. And they weren't just coming for the money. They were coming for the sovereignty of the nations themselves. They had a new plan. They called it structural adjustment. It sounds boring and technical, right? Like getting a chiropractic alignment. Trust me, it was anything but. It was economic surgery without anesthesia. But to understand the brutality of what happened next, we have to look at the playbook they used. A playbook that dismantled governments, starved healthcare systems, and turned independent nations into vassal states of the global financial system. And that brings us to the most infamous acronym in African economic history, the SAPs. 2. Structural Adjustment, the Economic Hitman's Playbook. If the 1960s were the honeymoon phase of African independence, and the 1970s were the wild party fueled by cheap credit, the 1980s were the hangover from hell. And I don't mean a drink some water and take an Advil hangover. I mean the kind where you wake up in a bathtub full of ice, missing a kidney, and there's a guy standing over you holding a scalpel and a bill for the surgery. That guy was the World Bank. The surgery was called the Structural Adjustment Program, or SAP. To understand why this happened, we have to look at the trigger, the Volcker shock. In 1979, Paul Volcker, the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, decided to crush American inflation. He raised interest rates to nearly 20%. It worked for the US, but it nuked the global economy. Suddenly, the interest payments on all those cheap loans Africa had taken out skyrocketed. At the same time, the global recession meant nobody was buying African copper, cocoa, or coffee. So imagine you are the finance minister of a typical African nation, Let's call it Zamberland for the sake of the scenario. It's 1982. Your phone is ringing off the hook. The schools have no chalk, the hospitals have no aspirin, the power is out because you can't afford to import oil, and there are angry crowds gathering outside your office, demanding to know why the price of bread just tripled. You need cash. Fast. You call the commercial banks in London and New York. They laugh and hang up. You're toxic. You call your old colonial masters. They shrug. Sorry, chap. Tight times. There's only one lender of last resort left. The World Bank and its scary big brother, the IMF. They fly into your capital city. A team of economists in sharp suits who have likely never bought a loaf of bread in a local market in their lives. They sit in your air-conditioned office, open their briefcases, and lay out a document. We can help you, they say. We have a bailout package ready. Millions of dollars. It will stabilize your currency and keep the lights on. You reach for the pen, desperate. Up, they say, pulling the paper away. Not so fast. This isn't a gift. It's a program. We need you to make some adjustments. This is the moment sovereignty died. These adjustments were based on a set of economic theories that would later be known as the Washington Consensus. Coined by economist John Williamson, it was a neoliberal wish list that believed the free market was God and the government was the devil. The World Bank told you that your economy was broken because your government was doing too much. You were crowding out the private sector. To get the loan, you had to agree to their conditionalities. And these weren't suggestions, they were commandments. If you missed a target, the next tranche of money would be frozen and your country would collapse. So, what were these commandments? They basically boiled down to 4 pillars of pain. Commandment 1, austerity, slash and burn. The bank argued that you were living beyond your means. You had to cut government spending immediately. Where do governments spend the most money? Social services. So they ordered you to fire civil servants. Thousands of them. Teachers, nurses, administrators. Gone. They told you to stop subsidizing food and fuel. Let the market decide the price of maize, they said. Well, the market decided that maize was now too expensive for a family living on $1 a day. When you argued that people would starve, they showed you a graph that said fiscal efficiency would improve by 3%. You can't eat a graph, but try telling that to a spreadsheet in Washington. Commandment 2, currency devaluation. They told you your currency was artificially strong. You needed to devalue it to make your exports cheaper and more competitive globally. On paper, this makes sense. If your cocoa is cheaper, Europe will buy more of it, right? In reality, it destroyed the purchasing power of your people. If you devalue your currency by 50%, the price of everything you import, medicines, machinery, books, oil, doubles instantly. So, while you might, theoretically, sell a bit more coffee, your hospitals can no longer afford to import antibiotics. It was a race to the bottom. Commandment 3, trade liberalization. Tear down those walls, not the Berlin one, your trade tariffs. The bank argued that protectionism was inefficient. You needed to open your borders to free trade, remove tariffs on imported goods. Competition will make your local industry stronger, they promised. Here is what actually happened. Your local textile factory, which employed 500 people, was using machinery from the 1960s. Suddenly you flooded the market with cheap second-hand clothes from America and mass-produced goods from Asia. Your local factory didn't get stronger, it got crushed. It went bankrupt in 6 months. 500 people lost their jobs, and now your country doesn't make clothes anymore. You import them, which requires foreign currency, which you don't have. See the cycle. Commandment 4, privatization. This was the holy grail. The bank believed the state should own nothing. Water, electricity, telecommunications, railways, mines, sell it all. The private sector is more efficient, they chanted. We will do a deep dive on this later, but spoiler alert, when you sell a natural monopoly like water to a private company whose only goal is profit, they don't usually prioritize connecting a slum to the water grid. They prioritize raising rates. These 4 pillars form the structural adjustment logic. It was applied across the continent with a cookie-cutter approach. It didn't matter if you were Senegal, Zambia, or Kenya. The prescription was the same. It was like a doctor prescribing chemotherapy for a broken leg, a headache, and malaria. The results were catastrophic. Between 1980 and 1989, the economies of sub-Saharan Africa didn't grow. They shrank. Income per capita fell by 20%. Investment crumbled. Infrastructure decayed because there was no money to maintain it. The United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, eventually commissioned a study called Adjustment with a Human Face because the reality was so grim. They found that in countries under SAPs, malnutrition in children was rising, school enrollment was dropping, and diseases that had been under control were coming back. The World Bank's response: "You aren't adjusting hard enough, stick to the plan." They called it short-term pain for long-term gain. But the pain wasn't short-term, it became generational. When you fire a teacher today, you don't just lose a job, you create a classroom of 80 kids instead of 40. The quality of education drops. 10 years later, you have a workforce that lacks the skills to compete in the modern world. You have structurally adjusted your future away. And the cruelest irony? The debt didn't go down. Because of the currency devaluations and the new loans taken to pay off old loans, Africa's total external debt skyrocketed from about $60 billion in 1980 to over $200 billion by the 1990s. They had followed the rules, they had starved their people, they had sold their assets, and they ended up owing 3 times as much money. This wasn't just bad economics, it was a racket. But the genius of the system was how it forced these countries into a specific role in the global economy. The World Bank didn't want Africa to industrialize and compete with the West. They wanted Africa to do one thing: extract raw materials and ship them north. And that brings us to the next layer of the trap: the compulsion to grow things you can't eat, to buy things you can't afford. 3. The cash crop trap. If structural adjustment was the surgery that removed the government's ability to protect its people, the cash crop trap was the diet plan that ensured they would starve while working harder than ever. Let's play a quick game. I want you to walk into your kitchen, open the pantry, and grab the ingredients for a standard dinner. Maybe some rice, some beans, maybe a potato or some corn. Now, imagine the World Bank walks into your kitchen, slaps the rice out of your hand and replaces it with a bag of raw cotton and a crate of cut flowers. Don't eat that, they say. Sell this to a guy in Belgium, then use the money he gives you to buy the rice back from a guy in Arkansas. But, you ask, wouldn't it be easier if I just grew the rice? No, the economist shouts. That's inefficient. You have a comparative advantage in flowers. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the economic logic that has kept Africa hungry for 40 years. To understand the cash crop trap, we have to look at the physical layout of African economies. If you look at a map of railways in Africa, most of which were built by the British or French, you'll notice something weird. They don't connect African cities to each other. They don't connect Lagos to Accra or Nairobi to Kampala. They connect the mines and the plantations to the ocean. They were built for one purpose: extraction, to get the stuff out. When African nations gained independence, they wanted to change this. They wanted to grow food to feed their growing populations. They wanted food sovereignty, the radical idea that a country should be able to feed itself before it feeds the world. But when the debt crisis hit in the 80s and the World Bank took the wheel, they looked at these domestic food sectors and sneered. "You need foreign currency," the bank said. "You need US dollars to pay back your loans. You can't pay us back in yams. We don't want your cassava. We want hard cash." So, how does a country get US dollars? By exporting things the West wants. The World Bank's experts pushed a strategy called export-led growth. They told African governments to stop supporting subsistence farmers who grew food for local markets, and instead pour all their resources into cash crops: cocoa, coffee, cotton, tea, rubber. On an individual level, this makes sense. If you're a farmer in Ghana and cocoa sells for a high price, you plant cocoa. Simple. But here is where the World Bank's advice turned into a trap. They didn't just give this advice to Ghana, they gave it to the Ivory Coast, and Nigeria, and Cameroon, and Indonesia, and Vietnam. They went to every developing nation in the tropical belt and said, "Psst, grow coffee, it's a gold mine." Now I want you to remember your Econ 101 class. What happens when supply skyrockets but demand stays the same? The price crashes. This is a phenomenon known in economics as the fallacy of composition. It's the idea that what is true for one person isn't true for everyone. If one person stands up at a concert, they see better. If everyone stands up, nobody sees better, and everyone's legs get tired. The World Bank encouraged the entire Global South to stand up at the same time. The results were devastating. In the 1980s and 90s, the world was flooded with tropical commodities. Take coffee. In the early 90s, under the guidance of the World Bank and IMF, Vietnam aggressively expanded its coffee production. They went from being a minor player to the second largest coffee producer in the world. Great for Vietnam? Maybe. But for African producers like Ethiopia, Uganda and Rwanda, it was an apocalypse. The global price of coffee collapsed. In 2001, coffee prices hit a 30-year low. Farmers in Ethiopia, the birthplace of coffee, were forced to walk away from their fields because it cost more to harvest the beans than they could sell them for. I want you to really visualize this. Imagine a farmer who has worked 14 hours a day in the sun, tending to his trees, only to find out that the fruits of his labor are literally worthless. He can't feed his children with coffee beans. Meanwhile, did the price of your Starbucks latte go down in 2001? Did Nestle and Kraft lower their prices? Of course not. The Western corporations that process and retail the coffee kept their prices stable and pocketed the difference. The efficiency of the market transferred wealth directly from the poorest farmers in Ethiopia to the shareholders of massive conglomerates in the West. And the World Bank? Did they apologize? Did they say, oops, maybe we shouldn't have told 50 countries to grow the exact same thing at the exact same time? No. They blamed the countries. They said, you didn't diversify enough. It's gaslighting on a global scale, but the trap gets deeper. Because while you are busy growing cocoa and coffee, you aren't growing food. In the 1960s, Africa was a net food exporter. It could feed itself. Today, Africa imports billions of dollars worth of food every year. Why? Because the best land, the most fertile soil, the land with access to water is reserved for export crops. Go to Kenya today. Near Lake Naivasha, you will see massive greenhouses stretching as far as the eye can see. They are beautiful, high-tech, efficient. What are they growing? Roses, carnations, cut flowers for the European market. Every Valentine's Day, when you buy that bouquet for your partner in London or Amsterdam, there's a good chance it came from Kenya. Those flowers require millions of litres of water. They require the best soil. Meanwhile, just a few hundred miles away in Turkana, Kenyans are starving due to drought. The water that could be growing maize or wheat to feed the local population is instead being virtually exported to Europe in the form of rose stems. This is the virtual water trade. Africa is exporting its most precious resource, water, embedded in crops that its own people can't eat, to pay off debts that were often accrued by dictators. And here is the kicker. Because African nations aren't growing their own food, they have to import it. They buy wheat from the US. They buy milk powder from the EU. And do you know why US wheat and EU milk are so cheap? Subsidies. The US government pays American farmers billions of dollars to grow grain. The EU pays French farmers to produce milk. This allows them to dump their surplus food on African markets at prices lower than the cost of production. An African farmer who receives zero subsidies because the World Bank told his government that subsidies are bad market interference cannot compete with a farmer in Iowa who is backed by the US Treasury. So, the African farmer goes out of business. The country becomes dependent on imported food. And to buy that imported food, they need US dollars. And to get US dollars, they have to grow more cash crops, which lowers the price of cash crops, which means they need to grow even more just to stay in the same place. It is a hamster wheel of poverty. Let's look at Ghana and cocoa. Ghana is one of the world's top cocoa producers. Cocoa is the main ingredient in chocolate, an industry worth over $100 billion a year. You would think Ghana would be rich, right? Wrong. Of that $100 billion chocolate industry, how much stays in the producer countries like Ghana and Ivory Coast? About 6%. The vast majority of the value is added in the processing, branding and retailing, which happens in Europe and America. The World Bank's rules on trade liberalization, remember Section 2, often make it difficult for African nations to industrialize and process their own goods. Tariff escalation in the West means that raw cocoa beans can enter Europe tax-free. But if Ghana tries to sell processed chocolate bars to Europe, they get hit with huge tariffs. The West says, we want your raw materials, we don't want your finished products, know your place. So Ghana stays a farm. It never becomes a factory, and the debt keeps growing. This system creates a vulnerability that is terrifying. When the war in Ukraine started in 2022, wheat prices spiked. African nations, which had been encouraged to stop growing grain and start growing strawberries for export, suddenly found themselves unable to afford bread. Food riots broke out. Governments panicked. And who did they call for help? The World Bank. And what did the World Bank offer? More loans. Are you seeing the pattern yet? The cash crop trap isn't an accident. It's a structural design feature of the global economy. It ensures that Africa remains a source of cheap raw materials for the global north and a captive market for the surplus goods of the West. It turns the continent into a massive plantation where the workers are paid in debt and the owners live on a different continent. But if you think forcing farmers to grow flowers while their children go hungry is bad, wait until you hear what they did to the hospitals. Because the World Bank didn't just come for the farms, they decided that staying alive was a luxury that should have a price tag. 4. User fees, putting a price on survival. If the cash crop trap was about stealing your future, this next chapter is about putting a price tag on your immediate survival. We're going to talk about one of the most morally bankrupt experiments in human history. It wasn't a medical experiment involving test tubes. It was an economic experiment involving human lives. It was called cost sharing, or if you want the less sanitized version, user fees. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1980s. You are a typical subsistence farmer in rural Malawi or Tanzania. You don't have a bank account, you don't have a credit card. Your wealth is measured in how many bags of maize you have in the shed, and maybe a couple of goats. For decades, under the post-independence social contract, if your child got sick with malaria, you walked to the government clinic. The lines were long, the building was hot, but the doctor would see you, and you would get chloroquine for free, if you wanted. If your kid to learn to read, you sent them to the local primary school for free. It wasn't luxury, but it was a safety net. Then, the World Bank economists arrived with their spreadsheets. They looked at the Ministry of Health's budget and shook their heads. Unsustainable, they tutted. Inefficient. They had a theory, a very specific, very Western economic theory called moral hazard. In insurance terms, moral hazard means that if you insure a guy's car for more than it's worth, he might park it in a bad neighbourhood hoping it gets stolen. If you make something free, people will abuse it. The World Bank actually believed that African peasants were abusing the healthcare system. They thought people were going to the doctor for fun, because, waiting 6 hours in a sweltering clinic with a screaming baby is everyone's idea of a great Saturday afternoon. So, they proposed a solution. Cost recovery. The logic was, if people have to pay a small fee, they will value the service more. It will stop the frivolous use of medical care. Plus, the money collected can be used to buy more medicine and pay the staff better. It sounds almost logical if you're sitting in an office in Washington, D.C., sipping a $5 latte. In the dusty villages of sub-Saharan Africa, it was a death sentence. The World Bank and IMF made the introduction of user fees a condition for loans. They essentially said, you want this bailout money? Put a turnstile on the hospital door. The most famous vehicle for this was the Bamako Initiative of 1987. It was launched in Bamako, Mali, and while it had noble goals of community participation, it became the Trojan horse for charging poor people for staying alive. So what happened when the fees were introduced? Did people value the service more? No, they stopped going. Attendance at health clinics plummeted overnight. In Kenya, after user fees were introduced at a provincial hospital, attendance dropped by 52%. In Ghana, it created what was called the cash and carry system. You literally had to pay cash before a doctor would touch you. Imagine this scenario. You're a woman in labour. You're rushing to the hospital. You're in agonising pain. You get to the reception and the nurse asks, "Where is the money?" You don't have it. Maybe the harvest was bad. Maybe your husband is away. "Sorry," she says. "This isn't hypothetical. This happened to thousands of women. They were turned away while in labour. They gave birth on the street outside the hospital gates, or they gave birth at home without skilled help. Maternal mortality rates, which had been slowly improving, stalled or worsened. But it gets darker. What if you were already in the hospital, you got treated but then couldn't pay the bill? Did they send you an invoice? Did they send it to collections? No. They initiated a practice that sounds like something out of a medieval dungeon. Hospital detention. Hospitals, desperate for the revenue the World Bank said they had to collect, started locking patients in. Women who had just given birth were chained to their beds. Men recovering from surgery were locked in guarded rooms. They were held hostage until their families could sell their cows, their land, or beg neighbours for the cash to release them. There are documented cases in Kenya, Nigeria, and the DRC of women being held for months with their newborns. These babies spent the first months of their lives as prisoners of debt. and the frivolous visits the World Bank was so worried about, turns out they didn't exist. When you charge for healthcare, people don't stop getting sick. They stop getting treated early. Instead of going to the clinic when the child has a fever, when it costs $1 to treat, they wait. They pray. They use traditional herbs. They wait until the child is convulsing, until the malaria has gone cerebral. Then they rush to the hospital. By then, the treatment is complicated and expensive, or it's too late. The World Bank had engineered a system that killed preventive medicine. They saved pennies on basic clinics and spent fortunes on emergency body bags, and they didn't stop at healthcare. They came for the schools too. In the 1980s, the World Bank published reports arguing that higher education in Africa was a luxury the state shouldn't subsidize. They even argued that primary education shouldn't be fully free. They pushed for school fees. Parents should contribute, they said. It increases accountability. So suddenly, school wasn't free. You had to pay for tuition, uniforms, books, building funds, chalk funds. For a family with 6 kids earning $300 a year, the math was impossible. They couldn't send everyone. They had to choose. Who gets to go to school? Who has to stay home and work in the fields? This is where the gender gap exploded. In many cultures, if you have to choose between educating a son or a daughter, you pick the son. The son carries the family name. The daughter will marry into another family. So millions of girls were pulled out of school. An entire generation of women lost their chance at literacy, independence, and a future beyond the farm. The irony is staggering. At the exact same time, the World Bank was publishing glossy brochures about empowering women and the importance of girl-child education. They were holding conferences on gender equality in one room and forcing policies that kicked girls out of school in the other. The devastation was so obvious that even the World Bank's own researchers couldn't ignore it forever. By the early 2000s, the evidence was undeniable. In countries like Uganda, when President Museveni abolished user fees for primary schools in 1996, against the initial wishes of the donors, enrollment nearly doubled overnight. From 2.5 million to 5 million kids. It turned out the kids weren't lazy. The parents didn't undervalue education. They were just broke. But the World Bank never really apologized. They just quietly changed the terminology. They stopped talking about cost recovery and started talking about safety nets. Oops, they basically said. My bad. We didn't realize that charging money to people with no money would mean they couldn't buy things. It was an error of arrogance. The economists in Washington viewed the world through the lens of supply and demand curves. They forgot, or didn't care, that healthcare and education are not consumer goods like toasters or sneakers. They are human rights. When you commodify survival, you don't get a more efficient market, you get a graveyard. But while the people were dying because they couldn't afford a $2 malaria pill, the state-owned assets of their countries were being prepared for the biggest garage sale in history, because the World Bank had decided that African governments shouldn't just stop providing services, they shouldn't own anything at all. Get your checkbooks ready, folks. We're going to a privatization fire sale. 5. The privatization fire sale. If you thought the user fees were cruel, wait until you see the business deal of the century. And by deal, I mean the kind of deal where you sell your kidney to buy a sandwich, and the guy taking the kidney also charges you for the surgery. Welcome to the privatization fire sale. Let's start with a simple analogy. Imagine you inherit a house. It's a bit run down. The roof leaks, the paint is peeling, and the plumbing makes a weird groaning noise. But it's your house. It provides shelter for your family. It's an asset. Now, imagine a consultant knocks on your door. He looks at the leak in the roof and says, "This house is inefficient. You're bad at managing it. You should sell it." "But where will I live?" you ask. "Don't worry," he smiles. "The new owner will rent it back to you. The market will optimize your living situation." So, under immense pressure, you sell the house. The consultant values it at $500. It's worth $500,000. You sell it to a friend of the consultant. The new owner immediately paints the door, fires the gardener, your uncle, and triples the rent. Oh, and he sends all the rent money to a bank account in the Cayman Islands. You're now homeless, broke, and watching someone else get rich off your grandfather's bricks. This is exactly what happened to African state-owned industries in the 1990s. To understand why, we have to look at the economic structure of post-independence Africa. When countries like Zambia, Ghana, and Nigeria became free, the private sector was tiny or non-existent. The colonial powers hadn't built local businesses, they had built extraction networks. So the new governments had to build the industries themselves. They created state-owned enterprises, SOEs. They built textile mills, cement factories, airlines, telecommunications companies, and mining giants. Were they perfect? Absolutely not. Many were bloated. Some were run by the president's incompetent cousin. Some were losing money. But they served a purpose. They employed thousands of people. They kept prices for essential goods stable. And crucially, the profits, when there were any, stayed in the country. Enter the World Bank and the IMF in the 1990s. Their ideology was simple. Government has no business in business. They argued that the state is inherently inefficient. They preached the gospel of the free market. Privatize, they screamed. Sell it all. The private sector brings efficiency, capital, and technology. It sounded like a solid MBA lecture. But in practice, it was a looting spree. The World Bank made privatization a condition for debt relief. You want to restructure your loans, sell your water company, sell your power grid, sell your mines. African governments were forced to put their national assets on the auction block. But here is the kicker. Because they were desperate, and because the World Bank flooded the market with assets from every African country at the same time, the prices collapsed. It was a buyer's market, and the buyers were vultures. Let's look at the most heartbreaking example, Zambia and the copper mines. Copper is to Zambia what oil is to Saudi Arabia. It is everything. For decades, the mines were owned by ZCCM, Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, a state giant. ZCCM was more than a company. It was a state within a state. It ran hospitals, schools, and football clubs. It provided cradle-to-grave welfare for the Copperbelt region. But by the late 90s, copper prices were low and the company was struggling. The World Bank and IMF held a gun to Zambia's head. Sell ZCCM, they said, or no more aid. The pressure was intense. The Zambian government, with World Bank experts advising them, unbundled the company and sold it off in pieces. Now, do the math with me. Some estimates valued the assets of ZCCM, the machinery, the infrastructure, the proven reserves of copper in the ground, at billions of dollars. How much did the Zambian government get when they sold the major units? Peanuts. One of the largest chunks was sold for $27 million in cash. $27 million for a mine that generates hundreds of millions in revenue per year. But the insult didn't stop at the sale price. The investors, mostly massive mining conglomerates from Europe, Canada, and later China, demanded sweeteners to seal the deal. They negotiated development agreements, secret contracts that superseded Zambian law. These contracts gave them tax holidays that would make Jeff Bezos blush. While the statutory tax rate for mining was around 35%, some of these companies negotiated rates as low as 0.6%. 0.6. They were also allowed to carry forward losses for up to 20 years. This meant they could use creative accounting to claim they were losing money on paper for decades, thereby paying zero tax while shipping billions of dollars worth of copper out of the country. And what about the efficiency the World Bank promised? Efficiency is corporate speak for firing people. The new owners didn't care about the social contract. They cared about shareholder value. They slashed the workforce. Tens of thousands of miners lost their jobs. They closed the hospitals and schools that ZCCM used to run. "We are a mining company, not a charity," they said. So the Zambian government was left with 1. No assets, 2. No tax revenue because of the tax holidays, 3. A massive unemployment crisis, 4. A social welfare bill they couldn't pay because the mines stopped funding the hospitals, and the World Bank. They patted themselves on the back. "Look," they said, "production has gone up." And it's true. Under private ownership, copper production did increase. The technology did improve. But who benefited? Not Zambia. The wealth was sucked out through a straw straight to London and Zurich. This happened everywhere. In Uganda, the government sold off over 130 state enterprises, everything from hotels to textile mills. In Nigeria, the privatization of the power sector became a masterclass in corruption, where assets were sold to political cronies who had no idea how to run a power plant, leaving the country in darkness. But the supreme irony, the thing that really makes you want to punch a wall, is who bought these assets. The World Bank said, "Governments are bad at running businesses. Private companies are good." So, who bought the African assets? Often it was companies like EDF, Électricité de France, or Chinese mining firms. Do you know what EDF is? It's a company owned by the French government. Do you know who owns the Chinese mining firms? The Chinese government. So, the World Bank forced African governments to sell their strategic assets because the state shouldn't own businesses, only for those assets to be bought by European and Asian states. It wasn't about private versus public, it was about African versus foreign. It was a transfer of sovereignty. If the French government owns your electricity grid, do you really have independence? If a Chinese state firm owns your copper, do you control your economy? The fire sale didn't just strip assets, it stripped dignity. It turned African states into mere landlords of their own territory, watching others harvest the crops. And while the factories were being sold for scrap, the World Bank was busy funding new projects. Massive, shiny, concrete projects. The kind that look great on a brochure but turn out to be completely useless in reality. Get your hard hats on. We're going to visit the graveyards of development. 6. White elephants in the jungle. We've talked about how they broke the farms, the hospitals, and the factories. Now let's talk about what they built in their place. I want you to picture an elephant, a white one. In ancient Siam, modern-day Thailand, the king would sometimes give a rare albino elephant to a courtier he didn't like. It sounded like a great honour. Wow, a sacred elephant, thanks your majesty. But here was the catch. You couldn't let the elephant work. It was sacred. You had to feed it special food. You had to bathe it. It required a team of handlers. The cost of maintaining this useless massive beast would eventually bankrupt the courtier. It was a gift designed to ruin you. In the world of development economics, the World Bank is the king of Siam, and Africa is the courtier's backyard, littered with the bones of white elephants. A white elephant, in economic terms, is a massive infrastructure project. A dam, a steel mill, a pipeline, a nuclear plant that costs billions to build, costs millions to maintain, and produces, well, mostly nothing, except debt. It produces a lot of debt. The 1970s and 80s were the golden age of the white elephant. The World Bank and Western engineering firms had a romance that would make Romeo and Juliet look casual. They were obsessed with modernization. Their logic was, rich countries have big dams and highways. Therefore, if we build big dams and highways in Africa, Africa will be rich. It's like seeing Michael Jordan wearing Nikes and thinking, if I buy those shoes, I will be able to dunk from the free throw line. Spoiler, you won't. You'll just be a guy with expensive shoes who can't jump. Let's travel to the Democratic Republic of Congo, then called Zaire, to visit the king of all white elephants, the Inga Dams. The dream was seductive. The Congo River is a beast. It's powerful. Engineers looked at the Inga Falls and saw enough potential kinetic energy to power the entire African continent. They called it the Grand Inga Dream. In the 1970s, the World Bank, along with other Western backers, decided to fund the Inga Three and Inga the Sioux hydroelectric dams. The dictator in charge, Mobutu Sese Seko, we'll get to him properly in the next section, loved it. He wanted monuments to his greatness. He wanted pyramids. But a dam isn't useful unless you can move the electricity to where people actually live. The people lived in the capital, Kinshasa, and the scattered villages. But the money was in the Shaba province, Katanga, where the copper mines were. So the planners decided to build the Inga Shaba high-voltage direct current line. It was the longest high-voltage DC line in the world at the time, a technological marvel stretching 700 kilometers across the jungle. The price tag is started at $250 million. By the time they finished, it was over $1 billion. And that's in 1980s money. Adjusted for inflation, that's an astronomical sum. Now here is the white elephant moment. As the transmission lines snaked across the country, they passed over hundreds of villages. Villages that had no electricity. Villages where people cooked with charcoal and studied by candlelight. Did the power lines stop to connect them? No. The lines were literally buzzing over the heads of the people, carrying electricity solely to the copper mines, which were owned by foreign investors. It was a highway of power that had no exits for the poor. And the tragedy gets worse. By the time the project was finished, the copper prices had crashed. Remember the commodities trap? The mines weren't consuming enough power. The dam was operating at a fraction of its capacity. The turbines rusted. The maintenance cost was staggering. The result? Zaire was left with a massive debt that accounted for nearly half of the country's total external debt at the time. The people got no power, but the Western construction companies, Morrison Knudsen, an American firm, made a fortune building the line. They got paid in hard cash. Zaire got the bill. The Ingashaba line became a symbol of development gone wrong. It was a project designed not for the people, but for the extraction industry and the foreign contractors. But maybe you're thinking, that was the 70s. Surely they learned their lesson. Let's fast forward to the 2000s, the Chad-Cameroon pipeline. This was supposed to be the model project. The World Bank said, "We know we messed up in the past. This time we're going to do it right. We will fund this oil pipeline, but we will force the government of Chad to put the oil revenues into a special escrow account dedicated to poverty reduction. We will watch every penny." It sounded great. It was the smart, the elephant. The World Bank put up the money and the credibility to build a $3.7 billion pipeline to get oil from landlocked Chad to the coast of Cameroon. ExxonMobil and Petronas were the partners. Construction began, communities were displaced, farmers lost their land. Environmentalists screamed that it was destroying the rainforest. "Don't worry," the World Bank said. "Think of the schools and hospitals the oil money will build." The oil started flowing in 2003. The money started coming in. And then the president of Chad, Idriss Déby, said, "Actually, I changed my mind." He wanted to buy weapons to fight rebels. He wanted to bolster his regime. He changed the laws to access the poverty money. The World Bank huffed and puffed. They threatened to cut him off. Déby laughed. He had the oil now. He paid off the World Bank's portion of the loan, with help from other sources, and told them to get lost. The World Bank withdrew from the project in 2008 with its tail between its legs. But the damage was done. The pipeline was built. The environment was damaged. The people were displaced. The oil was flowing to the west. And the people of Chad, they were still poor. The poverty reduction was a myth. The project served its purpose for ExxonMobil. It failed its purpose for the people. These projects share a dirty secret: tide aid. When the World Bank or a Western nation loans money for a massive infrastructure project, there is often a stipulation, written or unwritten: you have to hire our companies to build it. So the World Bank loans Nigeria $100 million for a steel mill. Nigeria receives the debt, but the cash? The cash goes directly from Washington to a construction firm in Germany, the US, or France. The engineers fly in, they stay in the Sheraton, they drive Toyota Land Cruisers, they consult, they pour concrete, they get paid Western salaries, then they leave. The money effectively does a U-turn. It leaves the Western bank, touches African soil for a second, and flies right back to a Western corporate bank account. Africa keeps the receipt. Let's look at the Ajaokuta steel mill in Nigeria. It is perhaps the most tragic industrial corpse in the world. Started in 1979 with Soviet assistance, and later Western financing attempts to revive and manage it, it has consumed over $8 billion. It was supposed to be the bedrock of Nigeria's industrialization. Today, it has never produced a single bar of steel. Not one. It is a massive, rusting city of pipes and blast furnaces in the middle of nowhere. It employs thousands of people who do nothing but maintain the rusting equipment. It is a monument to corruption, poor planning, and the sunk cost fallacy. But the loans taken to build it, they are real. The interest is real. Why does the World Bank keep funding these things? Because they look good on a resume. It is much harder to measure the success of improving 10,000 small farms using sustainable techniques. That's messy. It's small scale. It takes time. But a dam, a pipeline, you can take a photo of that. You can cut a ribbon. You can put it in the annual report under transformational infrastructure. It's the edifice complex. The desire to build big things to prove you are doing something. There is also the corruption angle, which we will discuss next, but specifically regarding infrastructure. Kickbacks. Big projects mean big contracts. Big contracts mean it's easy to hide a 10% bribe. If you give 1 million farmers $100 each, it's hard to skim off the top. Too many witnesses. If you give one construction firm $100 million, it's very easy for $5 million to find its way into a Swiss bank account owned by the Minister of Energy. The Lesotho Highlands Water Project is a prime example. This was a massive system of dams to supply water to South Africa. In the early 2000s, it came out that major Western engineering firms, companies from the UK, Canada, France, Germany and Italy, had paid millions in bribes to the project's chief executive Moussa Soleh to secure contracts. Now, usually in the narrative of African corruption, we blame the African official. Look at that corrupt official, we say. But who paid him? Respectable, multinational corporations. The World Bank eventually debarred some of these companies, but for years this was standard operating procedure. The debt incurred by the project included the cost of the bribes. The people of Lesotho are effectively paying back the money that was used to bribe their own politicians. So, when you see a crumbling factory in the African bush, or a power plant that doesn't work, don't just see African incompetence, see a receipt, see a transfer of wealth, see a white elephant that trampled the grass, so flat that nothing else could grow. But white elephants need keepers. They need leaders willing to sign the papers and ignore the needs of their people. And the World Bank found the perfect partners in the dictators of the Cold War. Next, we're going to look at how the World Bank didn't just tolerate corruption, they financed it. 7. The corruption feedback loop. If you think the white elephants were a waste of money, wait until you meet the guys who didn't even bother building the elephant. They just took the money for the elephant, bought a villa on the French Riviera, and told the World Bank the elephant ran away. And the World Bank said, "Oh no, here's money for another elephant." Welcome to the corruption feedback loop. This is the chapter where we stop talking about economic incompetence and start talking about criminal negligence. We're going to explore how the World Bank didn't just accidentally lend money to corrupt leaders. They knowingly, willfully, and repeatedly financed some of the most brutal kleptocracies on Earth. Let's start with a definition. Kleptocracy. Rule by thieves. A government whose main goal is to loot the national treasury. Now, imagine you are a bank manager. A guy walks in. He's wearing a leopard skin hat and carrying a golden cane. He owes you $1 million. Already. You know for a fact that he used the last loan to buy pink champagne and private jets. You know his children are starving in the car park. Do you give him another loan? If you are a normal bank, no. You call the police. If you are the World Bank in the 1980s, you ask, "Do you want that in large or small bills, Mr. President?" The poster child for this insanity is Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, now the DRC. Mobutu was a character that fiction writers couldn't invent because he was too unrealistic. He ruled Zaire for over 30 years. He treated the national treasury as his personal ATM. He famously leased the Concorde, yes, the supersonic jet, from Air France just to take his family shopping in Paris. He would fill the plane with his entourage, fly to Europe, buy out the stores on the Champs-Élysées and fly back. While his people were dying of preventable diseases, he built a palace in his hometown of Gabadalite that was dubbed the Versailles of the jungle. It had marble, imported from Italy, chandeliers from France, and an airport runway long enough to land the Concorde. And who paid for this lifestyle? You guessed it. The loans. Between 1970 and 1994, Zaire received over $8.5 billion in loans from Western creditors, including the World Bank and IMF. And yet, by the time Mobutu fled in 1997, the roads were gone. The hospitals were empty. The economy had shrunk to 1958 levels. The money had vanished. Now, the World Bank will tell you, "We didn't know. We thought the money was for roads." This is a lie. They knew. We know they knew because of a man named Erwin Blumenthal. In 1978, the IMF, worried about where the money was going, sent Blumenthal, a terrified, no-nonsense German banker, to run Zaire's central bank. He was supposed to clean up the mess. Blumenthal lasted less than a year. He had to flee the country because he was threatened with death. But before he left, he wrote a secret report. It was explosive. He wrote that there was no chance Zaire's creditors would ever be repaid. He detailed how Mobutu and his cronies were simply withdrawing cash from the central bank whenever they felt like it. He explicitly warned the IMF and the World Bank to stop lending. He wrote, "Corruptive practices are established as a system." So what did the World Bank do with the Blumenthal report? Did they cut off the funds? No, they buried it. In the years after receiving that report, the World Bank and IMF actually increased their lending to Zaire. They gave Mobutu the biggest loan in African history just a few years later. Why? Why would a bank lend money to a guy they knew was stealing it? 2 words. Cold War. Zaire has vast mineral wealth. cobalt, copper, uranium. The uranium for the atomic bombs dropped on Japan came from the Congo. And strategically, Zaire is right in the middle of Africa. The US and Europe were terrified that if Mobutu fell, the Soviet Union would swoop in and take control of the minerals. Mobutu knew this. He played the West like a fiddle. He basically said, I might be a thief, but I'm your thief. If you cut me off, the commies win. So, the World Bank, acting as the financial arm of Western foreign policy, kept the tap open. They viewed the stolen billions as the cost of doing business to keep Zaire in the Western camp. This created a feedback loop. 1. The dictator steals the money. 2. The country defaults on debt payments. 3. The economy collapses. 4. The dictator says, I need a bailout or the country will fall to communism, chaos. 5. The World Bank gives a new loan to pay off the interest on the old loan. 6. The dictator steals a chunk of the new loan. 7. Repeat until the country is a hollow shell. There is an economic concept here called fungibility. It means that money doesn't have a specific identity. If the World Bank gives a government $10 million specifically to build a school, that frees up $10 million of the government's own tax revenue. Instead of spending that tax revenue on the school, as they would have had to do, the dictator can now spend it on tanks, or a villa, in Switzerland. Even if the World Bank monitors the school project perfectly, their money has indirectly funded the tanks. By propping up the budget of a corrupt regime, the World Bank effectively subsidizes the oppression of the people. Let's look at Nigeria and General Sani Abacha. Abacha was a military dictator who ruled in the 90s. He was less flamboyant than Mobutu but much more efficient at theft. He didn't spend it on Concords, he just wired it straight to accounts in Switzerland, Jersey, Liechtenstein and the UK. It is estimated he stole between $3 billion and $5 billion in just 5 years. While he was looting the country, Nigeria was still servicing its debts to the World Bank and the Paris Club. The Nigerian people were paying interest on loans that were keeping their oppressor in power. In 2005, the World Bank finally admitted that corruption was a problem. Paul Wolfowitz, another hawk from the Pentagon turned World Bank president, launched an anti-corruption crusade. But it was too little. Too late. The structure of the loans makes corruption easy. World Bank projects are often massive. We're talking $500 million for a road network. In a country with weak institutions that were weakened by structural adjustment, remember? Tracking that money is impossible. There is a term in development called leakage. It sounds like a plumbing problem. It's actually theft. A study in Uganda in the 1990s tracked money meant for primary schools. Do you know how much of the money actually reached the schools? 13%. 87% of the money leaked out between the Ministry of Finance and the school door. It was eaten by local officials, district officers and bureaucrats. The World Bank's response for decades was to claim political neutrality. Their charter forbids them from interfering in the political affairs of a member country. They used this clause as a shield. We can't tell Mobutu how to run his government. That would be political interference. We just look at the economics. This is, of course, absurd. Lending $1 billion to a dictator is a political act. Refusing to lend to a socialist government, which they did frequently, is a political act. The tragedy is that the debt remains long after the dictator is gone. Mobutu died in 1997. Abacha died in 1998. But the debt they accrued? It's still there. The young people of the DRC today, who weren't even born when Mobutu was buying pink champagne, are still servicing the debt he took out. International law has a concept for this called odious debt. The doctrine says that if a despotic power incurs a debt not for the needs or in the interest of the state, but to strengthen its despotic regime, then that debt is odious and should not be enforceable against the people after the dictator falls. It makes sense, right? If I steal your credit card and buy a bunch of illegal drugs, you shouldn't have to pay the bill. But in the world of international finance, this rule is rarely applied. The World Bank and the IMF generally do not recognize odious debt. They insist on repayment. A contract is a contract, they say. The government signed it. It doesn't matter if the government was a guy in a military uniform who seized power in a coup and shot anyone who disagreed with him. To the bankers, he was the legal signatory. So, when a democratic government finally takes over, like in Nigeria in 1999, they are greeted with a massive bill. President Obasanjo of Nigeria spent his first term travelling the world, begging for debt relief. He famously asked, "We borrowed money, but we didn't see the money. The money ended up in private pockets in Europe and America, and now you want the victims of the theft to pay back the theft?" The West's answer was, effectively, yes, but we can set up a payment plan. This feedback loop ensures that new democratic governments are crippled from day one. They can't spend money on healthcare or education because they have to send 30% or 40% of their budget to Washington and London to pay for the sins of the dictators the West supported. It is a perfect cycle. The West lends to the dictator steals the money and deposits it in Western banks. The dictator dies. The West demands the people pay back the loan. The people pay the West with interest. The Western banks keep the stolen deposit and get the loan repayment. They get paid twice. Africa gets robbed twice. And sometimes, even the success stories are built on a foundation of sand. Everyone loves to talk about Ghana. It's the darling of the West, the star pupil. But if you peel back the paint, you find the same rust underneath. Let's travel to Accra and see what happens when you do everything the World Bank tells you to do. 8. Ghana, the star pupil's hidden scars. We have spent a lot of time looking at the bad boys of Africa, the dictators, the kleptocrats, the white elephants. It's easy to look at Mobutu's Zaire and say, well, obviously that failed. The guy was wearing a leopard hat and drinking pink champagne. But what about the good kid? What about the country that did everything right? The country that finished its homework, tucked in its shirt, and sat in the front row smiling at the World Bank teacher? Ladies and gentlemen, meet Ghana. For decades, Western economists have pointed to Ghana as the star pupil of Africa. Look at Ghana, they say. They followed our advice. They liberalised. They privatised. They have democracy. They are the model for the continent. And on the surface, it looks true. Ghana is peaceful. It has cool vibes. It gave us the year of return. It has jollof rice that, don't kill me Nigerians, is pretty good. But if Ghana is the model of success, why? Has it gone to the IMF for a bailout 17 times since independence? 17 times? That's not a safety net. That's a subscription service. If you have to borrow money from your parents to pay rent 17 times in a row, you aren't financially stable. You're in a crisis. To understand the tragedy of the star pupil, we have to go back to 1983. Ghana was in trouble. There was a drought. Bushfires were destroying crops. 1 million Ghanaians had just been expelled from Nigeria and sent home. The shelves were empty. The leader at the time was Jerry John Rawlings. He was a flight lieutenant, a populist, a guy who initially railed against the West, but he was desperate. He turned to the World Bank and the IMF. They laid out the standard menu: structural adjustment, devalue the currency, the cedi, remove subsidies, fire civil servants, sell state assets. Rawlings bit the bullet. He signed the Economic Recovery Program, ERP. And here is the thing. The macro numbers improved. Inflation came down, GDP went up, the shops were stocked with goods again. The World Bank was ecstatic. They put Ghana on every brochure. See, structural adjustment works. But they were looking at the spreadsheet, not the street. While the GDP was growing, the inequality was exploding. The north of the country was left behind. Small industries collapsed because they couldn't compete with imported goods, and the debt began to pile up. By 2001, the star pupil was so broke it had to apply for HIPC status. Heavily indebted poor countries. This is basically global bankruptcy court. To get your debt written off, you have to admit you are destitute and agree to even more strict supervision from the World Bank. Ghana swallowed its pride. They accepted the label poor country in exchange for wiping the slate clean. Billions of dollars of debt were forgiven. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Never again, everyone said. Fast forward just 20 years to 2022. Where is the star pupil now? Back, in the principal's office. Broke. Again. In December 2022, Ghana announced it was suspending payments on its external debt. It had defaulted. Inflation hit 54%. The cedi became the worst performing currency in the world. In the markets of Accra, the price of kenke, a staple corn dough food, doubled. Then it tripled. Then the balls of kenke started getting smaller. People call it shrinkflation, but when you are poor, it's just hunger. So what went wrong? How did the model student fail the exam twice? The World Bank will tell you it was bad fiscal discipline. They will blame the Ghanaian government for spending too much money on free high school education. which was a major campaign promise, or for hiring too many people. They will say, Ghana partied too hard. But the real reason is structural. Remember the cash crop trap. After 40 years of following World Bank advice, what does Ghana export? Gold, cocoa, oil, raw materials. What does Ghana import? Everything else. Toothpicks, sugar, rice, cars, machinery, refined petrol. The World Bank's advice for 40 years focused on macroeconomic stability, keeping inflation low so foreign investors feel safe. They didn't focus on structural transformation, building factories to turn that cocoa into chocolate or that gold into jewellery. So, Ghana is trapped in the volatility of the global market. When the price of oil or gold drops, Ghana crashes. When the US Federal Reserve raises interest rates, like they did in 2022, the capital flies out of Ghana and back to America. The cedi crashes. This isn't bad behaviour by Ghana. It is the design of the system. You cannot become a rich country by selling raw beans and buying iPhones. The math doesn't work. But the most painful part of the 2023 crisis wasn't just the external debt. It was the domestic debt exchange. This is a fancy term for a haircut. Usually when a country goes broke, the foreign banks take a hit. But the IMF told Ghana, you need to restructure your domestic debt too. Who holds domestic debt? Ghanaian banks, Ghanaian pension funds, ordinary Ghanaian retirees who bought government bonds because they were told it was the safest investment in the world. Suddenly, the government said, hey, you know those bonds that were supposed to pay you 19% interest and mature next year? Yeah, we're going to swap those for new bonds that pay 8% and mature in 15 years. Imagine you are a 75-year-old retired teacher in Accra. You saved your whole life. You bought government bonds to pay for your heart medication. Suddenly, the government tells you your savings are effectively frozen for a decade. Your money is gone. We saw heartbreaking scenes in 2023. The Pensioner Bondholders Forum, old men and women with walking sticks and grey hair, picketing outside the Ministry of Finance in the blazing sun. They weren't protesters, they were grandparents. They held signs saying, don't kill us before our time, and I need to buy my medicine. It was a PR nightmare. But it was also the reality of the World Bank model. To satisfy the market, to get the IMF sign-off, the most vulnerable citizens had to be sacrificed. The World Bank says this is necessary to restore confidence. Confidence for whom? Confidence for the international investors. BlackRock and Vanguard need to feel confident. The grandmother in Kumasi? She doesn't matter to the algorithm. And here is the supreme irony of Ghana's wealth. Ghana is Africa's leading gold producer. It surpassed South Africa. It has oil. It has cocoa. It is a land flowing with milk and honey and bauxite. So why is the government broke? Because of the contracts. Under the World Bank's guidance in the 90s and 2000s, Ghana revised its mining codes to be investor-friendly. Attract foreign direct investment was the mantra. So they lowered royalties. They offered tax holidays. Result? Multinational mining companies take billions of dollars worth of gold out of the ground. How much does the government of Ghana get? A royalty rate of usually 3% to 5%. And the government owns a small 10% carried interest in the mines. So for every $100 of gold that leaves the country, Ghana gets maybe $7 or $8. The rest goes to shareholders in Toronto, London and New York. If Ghana tried to change this, if they said, hey, we want 50% of the gold revenue, the World Bank and the Western governments would scream. Resource nationalism, they would shout. You're violating contracts. We will sue you in international court. The credit rating agencies would downgrade Ghana to junk status instantly. The currency would collapse, so no. Ghanaian president dares to touch the contracts. They just keep borrowing money to fill the gap. They borrow money to build roads to the mines, so the foreign companies can extract the gold faster. It is a paradox. A rich country that is poor, a star pupil that is always in detention. The story of Ghana proves that playing by the rules doesn't work if the rules are rigged against you. You can privatize everything, you can have free and fair elections, you can have a free press, and Ghana has all of these things. But if your economic role in the world is simply to be a quarry and a plantation for the West, you will never be free. You will just be a well-behaved servant, and things get even messier when the service you are selling is something that every human being needs to survive. We talked about privatizing factories. Now let's talk about privatizing water. Because if you think paying interest on a loan is bad, try paying interest on the stuff that comes out of your tap. We're heading to Tanzania for one of the most disastrous experiments in the history of privatization. 9. The Water War. Tanzania's privatization disaster. We have talked about selling off the mines, the factories and the schools, but there is one thing that is more fundamental than all of that. You can live without copper. You can live without a steel mill. You can, tragically, survive without a classroom, but you cannot live without water. The human body is 60% water. If you don't drink for 3 days, you die. It is the definition of a human right. So naturally, the World Bank decided it would be a fantastic product to sell. Welcome to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The year is 2003. Dar es Salaam is a sweltering, humid coastal city. It is growing fast. The population is exploding, but the water pipes are from the colonial era. They are rusted, leaking and dry. Only about 100,000 households have running water. The rest, millions of people, buy water from vendors, jerry can by jerry can. It is expensive and it is often dirty. The Tanzanian government, led by the ruling party, CCM, knows this is a crisis. They want to fix the pipes. They want to expand the network to the slums, but they don't have the cash, so they go to the World Bank. We need a loan to fix the water system, they say. The World Bank smiles. They have a plan, but it's not just a loan, it's a philosophy. Public utilities are corrupt and inefficient, the bank lectures. The government shouldn't run the water. You need the private sector. You need a British or French company. They know how to run things. The World Bank makes it crystal clear. No privatization, no money. This wasn't a suggestion. It was extortion. The loan, about $143 million, was conditional on handing over the water authority to WASA, to a private operator. Tanzania, desperate for the infrastructure, agreed. They put out a tender, and the winner was a consortium called City Water. It was led by a British company called Bywater and a German engineering firm called Gorf. On paper, it looked great. World class. Technology. British efficiency. Investment capital. The contract was signed. Bywater took over. They were given a 10-year lease to run the water supply for the entire city. The World Bank issued press releases celebrating the deal. They called it a model for the rest of Africa. Finally, they said, the market will solve the thirst. So what happened when the British executives arrived in Dar es Salaam? Did the taps start flowing with Evian? Did the pipes fix themselves? No. What happened was a disaster that was equal parts tragedy and farce. First, let's look at the economics. Bywater wasn't actually putting in much of their own money. The capital investment was still coming from the World Bank loan, which the Tanzanian people would have to pay back. Bywater was just there to manage it. And by manage, I mean collect the money. Their primary goal wasn't to connect the poor, it was to increase revenue. And how do you increase revenue? You send bills. Suddenly, people who hadn't had running water in years started receiving bills. Rates increased. And for the poor people in the slums, the people the World Bank promised would benefit the most, they were ignored. Why? Because running pipes into a slum is hard, it's expensive, and poor people don't have much money to pay bills. From a profit-maximizing perspective, the slum is a bad market. So City Water focused on the rich neighborhoods and the hotels, but even there they failed. The British efficiency turned out to be a myth. The pipes kept leaking, the water kept getting lost. In fact, the service got worse. City Water was supposed to install new pipes. They didn't. They were supposed to pay a lease fee to the government. They stopped paying it. Within 2 years, the situation in Dar es Salaam was critical. Cholera outbreaks were a constant threat. People were rioting. The STAR project of the World Bank was collapsing in real time. The Tanzanian government, usually very polite and deferential to donors, had finally had enough. In May 2005, the water minister, Edward Lowassa, did something that is almost unheard of in the polite world of international diplomacy. He terminated the contract, but he didn't just send a letter. He went gangster mode. The government announced that City Water was in breach of contract. They raided the City Water offices. They installed a new CEO, a Tanzanian public servant. And then, this is the best part, they deported the British executives, literally kicked them out of the country. Get your bags, go to the airport, goodbye. The people of Dar es Salaam cheered. It was a moment of national pride. They had taken back their water, but the story doesn't end there. Because in the world of global finance, you can't just kick out a Western corporation, even if they are incompetent. There are rules, there are treaties. Bywater was furious. They didn't apologize for failing to provide water. They didn't apologize for the cholera. They sued. They dragged Tanzania to a secret court in The Hague called the ICSID, International Centre for Settlement of Investment Disputes. This is a World Bank tribunal. Yes, you heard that right. The World Bank forced Tanzania to privatize. The World Bank picked the company failed, and then the company used a World Bank court to sue Tanzania for kicking them out. Bywater demanded millions of dollars in compensation for expropriation. They argued that by deporting their staff and seizing the offices, Tanzania had violated the bilateral investment treaty between the UK and Tanzania. Imagine the audacity. You hire a plumber. He breaks your pipes, floods your basement, and charges you double. You fire him. He sues you for lost future profits because he planned to keep plumbing your house for 10 years. That is the ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement System. It is a mechanism that allows corporations to sue sovereign nations if the nation passes a law that hurts the corporation's profits, even if that law is, we need water to live. The legal battle dragged on for years. It cost the Tanzanian government a fortune in legal fees, money that could have been spent on, well, water. In the end, the tribunal reached a verdict in 2008, and it was a fascinating mixed bag. The judges ruled that yes, Tanzania had violated the treaty by storming the offices, it was undue process, but they also looked at City Water's performance. They looked at the books, and they concluded that the company was so incompetent and the value of the investment was so worthless that Bywater deserved $0 in compensation. The tribunal basically said, yes, they kicked you out illegally, but you were terrible, so you get nothing. It was a moral victory for Tanzania, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The experiment had wasted 5 years. 5 years where no pipes were laid. 5 years where children drank dirty water. 5 years of debt accumulating on the World Bank loan. After City Water was kicked out, the Tanzanian government took the utility back under public control. DAWASA, the public agency, took over. And guess what? They did a better job. They weren't perfect, but they extended the network. They stabilized the supply. They were accountable to the people, not to shareholders in London. The Dar es Salaam water crisis exposed the lie at the heart of the privatization push. The World Bank assumes that the private sector has a monopoly on competence. They assume that a guy in a suit from London automatically knows more about delivering water in Africa than a Tanzanian engineer. It turns out, water is a natural monopoly. You can't have competition in water pipes. You don't have 5 different pipes coming into your house so you can choose the cheapest one. There is only one pipe. If you give that pipe to a private company, you are creating a private monopoly. And a private monopoly has no incentive to serve the poor. The poor are high risk, low return. The rich are low risk, high return. The market logic dictates that the poor should go thirsty, but the World Bank didn't learn. They tried it in Bolivia. Remember the Bechtel Water War? They tried it in Ghana, Aqua Vitens Rand. They tried it in Manila. Everywhere they go, the logic is the same. Commodify the essentials, and everywhere the result is the same. The poor pay more or they go without. But wait, it gets worse. Because while Tanzania was fighting off British lawyers, other African nations were dealing with a different kind of ghost. The ghost of debts past. Debts that were taken out by regimes that no longer exist. For countries that have changed their names, but are still being paid by you and me. We're going to talk about the most unfair concept in law, odious debt, or as I like to call it, paying for the whip that beat you. 10. Odious debt, paying for your oppressor's lunch. Imagine you come home one day to find your house has been broken into. The burglar beat you up, tied you to a chair, and then stole your credit card. While you were tied up, he went on a shopping spree. He bought a shotgun to threaten you with, a set of gold chains and a first-class ticket to the Bahamas. Eventually you manage to untie yourself. You call the police. The burglar is caught. Justice is served. But then, a month later, you get your credit card bill. It's for $50,000. You call the bank. I didn't spend this, you scream. The guy who tied me up spent it. And the bank manager says, well, the card is in your name, and technically he was in charge of your house when he swiped it, so cash or check? This sounds insane, right? In domestic law, this is fraud. You wouldn't pay a dime, But in international law, this is standard procedure. It is called odious debt, and it is the reason why millions of Africans are currently paying back loans that were used to oppress, torture, and kill their parents. The legal definition of odious debt was actually crafted by a Russian legal theorist named Alexander Nahum Sack in 1927. He argued that if a despotic regime incurs a debt not for the needs or in the interest of the state, but to strengthen its despotic regime, and the creditors knew this, then the debt belongs to the regime, not the people. If the regime falls, the debt should fall with it. It's a brilliant moral legal theory, and the World Bank treats it like it doesn't exist. Let's look at the most painful example in modern history, South Africa. For over 40 years, the apartheid regime ruled South Africa with brutal efficiency. It was a crime against humanity. The minority white government stripped black South Africans of their citizenship, forced them into Bantustans, and used a massive police state to crush dissent. But running a police state is expensive. You need tear gas. You need armoured vehicles, Caspirs. You need guns. You need to fund secret wars in Angola and Namibia to fight communism. Where did the apartheid government get the money? They borrowed it. Despite sanctions, Western banks, including American, British, German and Swiss banks, continued to lend billions to the apartheid regime. The IMF even granted South Africa a $1.1 billion loan in 1982, the same year the regime was cracking down violently on trade unions. The banks knew what the money was for. It wasn't for schools in Soweto. It was for the military machine that was keeping Nelson Mandela in prison. Fast forward to 1994. Freedom! Nelson Mandela walks free. The ANC wins the election. The Rainbow Nation is born. The world cheers. But the day Mandela walked into the Union buildings in Pretoria, the bankers were waiting in the lobby. They handed him a bill. The apartheid regime had left behind a national debt of roughly $22 billion. A huge chunk of this was money borrowed to buy. The weapons used to shoot the very people who just voted for Mandela. Mandela was faced with an impossible choice. Option A. Repudiate the debt. Tell the banks, this is odious debt. We aren't paying for our own oppression. Go chase the guys who signed the checks. Option B. Pay the debt to keep the markets happy. The Western financial establishment, the World Bank, the IMF and the commercial banks, terrified the new ANC government. They warned that if South Africa defaulted, the currency, the rand, would collapse, foreign investment would flee, and the new democracy would fail before it started. You have to honour the continuity of the state, they lectured. South Africa is the legal entity. You inherited the assets, you inherit the liabilities. So Mandela and the ANC caved. They agreed to pay. Think about the tragedy of that. The freedom dividend, the money that should have been used to build houses for the poor, to electrify the townships, to fix the Bantu education system, was instead siphoned off to repay the banks in Zurich and London who had financed apartheid. For years after 1994, debt service was the second largest item in the South African budget, after education. It was bigger than the health budget. The victims were paying for the crimes of the perpetrators, but South Africa isn't alone. This is a continental plague. Let's go to Liberia. In the 1980s, the country was ruled by Samuel Doe, a master sergeant who took power in a bloody coup. He was a brutal dictator, but he was America's dictator. Cold War again. The US and international institutions poured money into Liberia. Doe stole it. He mismanaged it. He built a debt mountain of over $4 billion. Then came the Civil War. Chaos. Charles Taylor. More chaos. Finally, in 2005, Liberia elected Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first female head of state in Africa. She inherited a country in ruins, no electricity, no running water, and a $4.7 billion debt. Liberia's GDP at the time was only about $400 million. The debt was 800% of the national income. It was mathematically impossible to pay. Yet for years, Liberia was technically in arrears. They couldn't get new money to rebuild because they owed old money that Samuel Doe had squandered. It took years of campaigning by activists, like the Jubilee 2000 movement, to finally get that debt cancelled. But why did it take a campaign? Why wasn't it automatic? Why is the default position of the World Bank you must pay, rather than let's audit this debt to see if it's legitimate? The answer lies in the sanctity of the contract. To the global financial system, a contract is more sacred than a human life. If we allow countries to say, we aren't paying this because the guy who signed it was a bad dude, the banks panic. They say, this introduces risk. How do we know who is a bad dude? If we set a precedent, everyone will default. So to protect the stability of the bond market, the people of the Congo must starve to pay for Mobutu's palaces. The people of Nigeria must suffer to pay for Abacha's theft. But here is the darkest twist. Sometimes the debt isn't just stolen. It is used to buy useless junk that the West wanted to get rid of. In the 1970s and 80s, Western export credit agencies, government bodies that help their companies sell stuff abroad, pushed African governments to buy things they didn't need on credit. It was basically a government-backed sales scam. There is a famous story about Togo. In the late 70s, a Western contractor convinced the government of Togo that they needed a steel mill. Togo doesn't have iron ore, Togo doesn't have coal. So, to make steel, they would have to import the iron and the coal, process it in Togo, and then sell it? To whom? It made zero economic sense, but the Western banks financed it. The Western contractor built it. The steel mill ran for a few months, produced nothing of value and shut down. The contractor got paid. The banks got their interest. Togo got a rusting hulk and a massive debt that they were paying off for decades. This is supply-driven corruption. The loan didn't originate because Togo said, we need a steel mill. It originated because a steel mill manufacturer in Europe needed a sale and a banker needed a commission. So, when the World Bank lectures Africa on good governance and fiscal responsibility, it feels like a slap in the face. Where was the due diligence when you were lending billions to dictators? Where was the fiduciary responsibility when you funded projects that defied the laws of physics and economics? The World Bank acts like a forgetful arsonist. They burn down your house and then return the next day selling you bricks to rebuild it, charging interest on the bricks. Terrible fire you had there, they say. You really should be more careful. And the trap is self-perpetuating. Because these countries are saddled with odious debt, their credit ratings are trash. Because their credit ratings are trash, when they do need to borrow legitimate money, say for a pandemic or a climate disaster, they are charged predatory interest rates. They pay a risk premium. The risk premium exists because they have so much debt. The debt exists because the banks lent to dictators. It is a circle of extraction. So the next time you hear about an African country defaulting or seeking a bailout, don't think of a deadbeat friend who is bad with money. Think of the victim of a credit card scam who is finally refusing to pay the bill for the thief's vacation. But the West has a counter-argument. They say, well, we provide aid, we give back. Ah, yes, aid. But what if I told you that a huge chunk of that aid is just another way to destroy African markets? What if I told you that the West demands Africa stop subsidizing its farmers, while simultaneously dumping subsidized American wheat and European milk on African tables? It's time to talk about the hypocrisy of subsidies. The rule is, free markets for you, protectionism for me, or 11, subsidies for me, but not for thee. If there is one thing that makes you want to flip a table in the world of development economics, it is the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of Western agricultural policy. Imagine a boxing match. In the blue corner, we have an African farmer. He is lean, hard-working, and fights barefoot. In the red corner, we have an American corporate farmer. He is driving a tractor that has air conditioning and GPS, but that's not enough. Before the bell rings, the referee, let's call him the World Bank, walks over to the African farmer and ties his hands behind his back. No subsidies, the referee shouts. That's against the rules of the free market. You have to fight fair. Then the referee walks over to the American farmer and hands him a baseball bat made of solid gold. Here you go, son, the referee whispers. This is a production support instrument. Go get him. This is the reality of global trade. The West preaches free markets to Africa, while practicing socialism for the rich at home. To understand this, we have to look at the Common Agricultural Policy, SAP, in Europe and the Farm Bill in the United States. These are massive government programs that pour billions of dollars, we're talking $1 billion a day globally in OECD countries, into the pockets of Western farmers. Now, why is this a problem for Africa? Because of dumping. When a French farmer is paid by his government to produce milk, he produces too much milk. More than France can drink. He has a surplus. Normally, if you have too much stuff, the price crashes. But because he has already been paid his subsidy, he can afford to sell the extra milk for dirt cheap. Cheaper than the cost of water. So European companies turn that milk into powder and ship it to Senegal or Mali. The Senegalese dairy farmer, who has 5 cows and wakes up at 4 a.m. to milk them by hand, walks to the market. He tries to sell his fresh milk for a fair price, let's say $1 a litre. Next to him is a stack of imported European milk powder. When you mix it with water, it costs $0.50 a litre. The consumer, who is poor because of the debt crisis we talked about, buys the cheap powder. The Senegalese farmer can't sell his milk. He pours it into the dirt, he goes bankrupt, he sells his cows, he moves to the city to find a job that doesn't exist. Senegal becomes dependent on imported milk. The World Bank forced African nations to lower their trade tariffs, remember these SAPs, meaning they couldn't put a tax on this cheap milk to protect their farmers. They stripped the armour off the African economy, and then the West opened fire with subsidised goods. Let's look at the cotton scandal. This is the most blatant example of economic warfare. In West Africa, there is a group of countries known as the C4: Benin, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mali. These are some of the poorest countries on earth, but they have one great asset: they grow incredible cotton. They pick it by hand, which preserves the quality. Their production costs are very low because they have the perfect climate and hard-working farmers. In a truly free market, the C4 countries would dominate the cotton trade. They are the efficient producers, but in the United States there are about 25,000 cotton farmers. They are politically powerful. Every year the US government writes checks totaling billions of dollars to these guys. In some years, the subsidy check is actually higher than the value of the cotton they grew. It's literally more profitable to farm the government than the land. Because of these subsidies, US farmers produce a massive glut of cotton. They dump it on the global market. This pushes the global price of cotton down, way down. So the farmer in Burkina Faso, who receives 0 subsidies, because the World Bank told his government that subsidies are bad market interference, goes to sell his harvest. The global price is so low he can't even cover the cost of his seeds. He is competing against the US Treasury, and you can't beat the US Treasury. Oxfam estimated that US cotton subsidies cost African countries hundreds of millions of dollars a year in lost export earnings. That is money that could build schools. That is money that could build hospitals. Instead, it is lost because politicians in Washington need the votes of cotton farmers in Texas. The irony? The US gives foreign aid to Burkina Faso. They might give $50 million in aid to alleviate poverty. At the same time, their trade policy destroys $100 million worth of the local economy. It's like stealing a man's car and then tossing him a bus token. See? I'm helping. Now, let's talk about tomatoes. If you go to Ghana, you will see a tragedy in a can. Ghana has the perfect climate for growing tomatoes. In the north, around Pwalugu, there used to be a thriving tomato industry. There was even a factory, the Pwalugu Tomato Factory, built to process the local harvest into paste. Today, that factory is a ghost town. It's a white elephant. Why? Because if you go to a market in Accra, the shelves are stacked with cans of tomato paste. Gino, salsa, flip the can over. Made in Italy, made in China. The European Union heavily subsidizes its tomato farmers, mostly in Italy and Spain. They produce a massive surplus. They process it into paste and ship it to West Africa. Because of the economic partnership agreements, free trade deals pushing by Europe, these cans enter Ghana with very low tariffs. The Italian paste is sold for less than the cost of growing fresh tomatoes in Ghana. The Ghanaian tomato farmers watch their crops rot in the fields. Some of them become so desperate they commit suicide. Others migrate. They travel across the Sahara. They get on leaky boats in Libya. They try to cross the Mediterranean to get to Italy. Why? To pick tomatoes. Think about the insanity of that loop. The Ghanaian farmer is put out of business by Italian tomatoes, so he travels to Italy illegally to work as a slave labourer picking the very tomatoes that put him out of business, which are then shipped back to Ghana to destroy the next generation of farmers. And the World Bank's advice: you should diversify, maybe grow something else. Grow what? If they grow chickens, they get hit by the poultry dumping. In the 1990s, the World Bank forced African nations to lift bans on imported meat. Europeans and Americans love chicken breasts. They pay a premium for the white meat. But chickens also have legs, thighs, and wings. Shocking biology, I know. Western consumers don't want the dark meat as much. It's a byproduct. So the Western poultry giants freeze the legs and thighs and ship them to Africa. They sell them for pennies. It's basically waste disposal for them. In Ghana, the market share of domestic poultry producers fell from 95% in 1992 to 11% in 2001. The industry was wiped out. You can't raise a chicken for 40 cents. It's impossible. You have to buy feed, medicine, electricity. But you can buy a frozen, imported thigh for 40 cents. Now, Ghana imports hundreds of millions of dollars worth of chicken every year. This uses up their scarce foreign currency, US dollars, which creates a balance of payments crisis, which forces them to go back to the IMF for a loan. The free market turned a food-secure nation into a net food importer. And don't get me started on second-hand clothes. We all donate our old clothes to charity, right? We feel good about it. My old Gap t-shirt is going to help a poor kid in Africa. Well, actually, it's going to kill a textile factory. Those clothes are bundled up and sold by the ton to wholesalers who ship them to Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda. They call it mitumba. It's everywhere. Massive markets selling cheap, used Western clothes. It provides cheap clothing for the poor. That's the pro. The con? It destroyed the local textile industry. In the 1980s, Kenya had a thriving textile sector. They grew cotton, spun it, and made clothes. It employed 500,000 people. When the markets were forced open, the flood of used clothes drowned the local factories. Who can compete with a t-shirt that cost 0.10 DIS because it was donated for free in London? In 2016, the East African community, Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, tried to ban the import of used clothes. They said, "We want to rebuild our dignity. We want to make our own clothes. We don't want to wear a dead American's t-shirt." What did the US do? The US threatened to kick them out of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. They effectively said, "If you ban our old clothes, we will sanction your exports." Kenya caved. They kept the old clothes. Rwanda stood firm. The US punished Rwanda by putting tariffs on Rwandan exports. This is the power dynamic. The West reserves the right to protect its industries, its farmers, and its strategic interests. But when Africa tries to do the same, it is economic heresy. The World Bank's role in this was the dismantling of the state supports. Before the 80s, African governments had marketing boards. These boards bought crops from farmers at a guaranteed price. They provided fertilizer subsidies. They managed grain silos to store food for bad years. The World Bank dismantled all of this. "Inefficient," they screamed. "Let the private sector handle fertilizer." But the private sector didn't go to the remote villages because it wasn't profitable. So the farmers were left with nothing. No fertilizer, no guaranteed price, no protection from dumping. They were thrown into the deep end of the global market with rocks tied to their feet. The result is a continent that has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, yet spends $50 billion a year importing food. It is a paradox created by policy. It is hunger by design. But if you think fighting the US Treasury is hard, try fighting the weather. Because while the economic climate is rigged, the actual physical climate is collapsing. And guess what? The solution to that crisis is just another debt trap in disguise. Get your solar panels ready. We are going to talk about the climate finance paradox. 12. The climate finance paradox. I want you to imagine a scenario. You live in a nice, modest wooden house. You take care of it. You don't smoke. You don't play with matches. Your neighbour, however, is a pyromaniac. He hosts massive bonfires every night. He shoots fireworks at your roof. He burns tyres for fun. One day, inevitably, a spark from his bonfire lands on your roof. Your house catches fire. It burns to the ground. You lose everything. You're standing in the ashes crying. Your neighbour walks over. He looks at the destruction he caused. "Man, that sucks," he says. "Fire is dangerous. You really should have fireproofed your house." Then he pulls out his checkbook. "Tell you what, I'm a nice guy. I will lend you the money to rebuild. I'll charge you 5% interest, and you have to buy the bricks from my brother's brick factory." If you punched that neighbour in the face, no jury in the world would convict you. But in the world of geopolitics, you can't punch the neighbour. You have to thank him. This is the climate finance paradox. Here is the cold, hard data. The entire continent of Africa, 1.4 billion people, is responsible for less than 4% of global carbon emissions. If you removed Africa from the planet tomorrow, the climate crisis would effectively remain unchanged. Meanwhile, the G20 nations, the rich guys, are responsible for 80% of emissions. Yet, who is paying the price? Africa is warming faster than the rest of the world. Cyclones are smashing into Mozambique. Droughts are turning the Horn of Africa into dust. Floods are drowning Nigeria. The people suffering the most are the ones who contributed the least. This is climate apartheid, but the trap isn't just the weather, it's the bill. Because when these disasters strike, the World Bank and the IMF rush in with their solutions, and almost always the solution is debt. Let's look at Mozambique and Cyclone Idai in 2019. This was a monster storm. It flattened the city of Beira. It killed over 1,000 people. It caused billions of dollars in damage. Mozambique was already drowning in debt, thanks to the hidden debt scandal we discussed earlier. They didn't have the cash to rebuild. So, the IMF approved a $118 million emergency loan. The World Bank pledged millions more, mostly in loans. Think about the morality of that. The West burned the fossil fuels that warmed the ocean, that created the cyclone that destroyed Mozambique, and then the West profited from the destruction by lending money to the victim. Mozambique now has to pay interest on the destruction of its own people. The storm didn't just destroy buildings, it destroyed the country's balance sheet. This is happening everywhere. According to Oxfam, for every $1 of climate funding that goes to developing countries, about 80 cents is in the form of loans. Only a tiny fraction is grants, free money. So climate action has become just another business line for the banks. They are monetizing the apocalypse. But it gets even more hypocritical when we talk about energy. For 200 years, Europe and America got rich by burning coal and oil. They built their factories, their navies, and their middle classes on cheap, dirty energy. Now that they are rich, they have climbed up the ladder and are trying to kick the ladder away so no one else can climb it. They tell Africa, "You can't use your fossil fuels, it's bad for the planet. You have to use solar and wind. You have to leapfrog to green energy." Leapfrogging sounds cute, like a frog jumping over a lily pad. In reality, it's incredibly expensive. Solar and wind are cheap to run, the sun is free, but they are very expensive to build. You need massive upfront capital, you need batteries, you need smart grids. Africa has massive reserves of natural gas. Nigeria, Senegal, Mozambique, Tanzania. They could use this gas to generate electricity now, to power factories now, to lift people out of poverty now. Gas is cleaner than coal. It could be a transition fuel. But the World Bank and many Western governments have announced that they will stop funding fossil fuel projects overseas. "We are going green," they cheer. So, an African country goes to the World Bank and says, "We found gas. We want to build a power plant to light up our schools." The World Bank says, "Sorry, we don't fund gas anymore. Climate change, you know." Then the African leader turns on the TV and sees Germany reopening coal plants because of the war in Ukraine. He sees the US expanding LNG, liquid natural gas, exports. He sees the UK issuing new licenses for North Sea oil drilling. The message is clear. Fossil fuels are okay for us because we need energy security, but they are not okay for you. You have to stay in the dark to save the planet. It is the ultimate double standard. And when Africa agrees to go green, the deal is often a trap in disguise. Let's look at the Just Energy Transition Partnership, JEP, in South Africa. This was announced at COP26 with huge fanfare. The West, US, UK, EU promised $8.5 billion to help South Africa transition away from coal. Headlines screamed, "Historic deal! The West pays up!" But when South African negotiators read the fine print, the smile faded. Was it a check for $8.5 billion? No. Less than 4% of it was grants. The rest, commercial loans, concessional loans, risk guarantees. Basically, the West said, "We will help you shut down your coal plants, which provide jobs and cheap power, by letting you borrow more money from us to buy our wind turbines." South Africa already has a debt crisis. Taking on $8 billion more in foreign currency debt is a massive risk. If the rand crashes, paying back that green loan could bankrupt the treasury. So, the transition becomes a debt trap. This is why African leaders are pushing for loss and damage. This is the legal concept of reparations. If you crash your car into my car, you don't loan me money to fix it. You, or your insurance, pay for it. Liability. The rich nations are terrified of this word, liability. At climate summits, COPs, The American and European diplomats fight tooth and nail to ensure that loss and damage is never defined as liability or compensation. They call it solidarity. Solidarity is charity. It's voluntary. It's, I'll give you $10 if I feel like it. Liability is mandatory. In 2022 at COP27, they finally agreed to create a loss and damage fund. It was a breakthrough. But so far, the pot is almost empty. The pledges are peanuts compared to the trillions needed. And there is a huge fight over who manages the fund. Guess who wants to manage it? The World Bank. Developing nations screamed, no! They know the World Bank's playbook. They know that if the World Bank runs the fund, it will turn into another loan dispensary. It will come with conditionalities. We will give you money to rebuild your flooded village, but you have to privatize your water supply first. The climate finance paradox creates a cruel future. As the world gets hotter, African economies will get hit harder. Every time they get hit, they will need to borrow to rebuild. The more they borrow, the less they can invest in resilience, seawalls, irrigation. So the next disaster hits them even harder. It is a death spiral. The environment destroys the economy, and the global financial system makes sure the economy never recovers. But as the West plays these games, lecturing about solar panels while drilling for oil, offering loans disguised as aid, a new player has entered the chat. A player with deep pockets, a hunger for resources, and a very different way of doing business. They don't care about your carbon footprint. They don't care about your human rights record. They just want to build a road and maybe take a copper mine in exchange. Is China the saviour Africa has been waiting for? Or is the dragon just a different kind of monster? 13. The China comparison. Out of the frying pan? For 50 years, the relationship between Africa and the West was like a bad marriage. The West was the controlling husband who controlled the bank account, criticised your cooking, and occasionally locked you in the basement for your own good. Then, around the early 2000s, a new guy moved into the neighbourhood. He drove a flashy car. He didn't care if you cleaned the house. He didn't care if you went to church. He just wanted to do business. His name was China. And suddenly the African governments had options. If the World Bank said, we won't lend you money for a road unless you privatise your water and hold an election, the African leader could now say, that's cool, I'll just call Beijing, they'll be here on Tuesday. This terrified the West. If you read the New York Times or the Financial Times, you will see endless headlines screaming about Chinese debt trap diplomacy. The narrative goes like this: China is an evil predator. They lend money to poor countries on purpose, knowing they can't pay it back just so they can seize their ports and mines. They are the loan sharks of the 21st century. But is that true? Or is the West just jealous that their ex-wife found a new boyfriend? Let's look at the Angola model. This is the blueprint for how China conquered Africa without firing a shot. In 2002, the Angolan civil war finally ended. The country was destroyed. Landmines everywhere. Bridges blown up. The Angolan government went to the West for help. The IMF said, sure, we can help, but first, we need to audit your oil accounts, cut your budget, and you need to sign this 500-page document on governance. Angola said, pass. Then they went to China. China said, we need oil, you need roads, let's swap. It was called Resources for Infrastructure. China Exim Bank, the state bank, provided billions in credit lines. Chinese construction companies flew in to build railways, airports, and stadiums. Angola paid them back not with cash, but with shipments of oil. On the surface, this looked brilliant. It bypassed the corrupt Angolan bureaucracy. The money never touched the hands of Angolan ministers. It went straight from the bank in Beijing to the construction firm in Luanda. Roads got built, fast. If you go to Luanda today, the skyline looks like Dubai or Shanghai. It's impressive. But there is no such thing as a free lunch, especially not one served with Peking duck. The problem with the Chinese model is opacity. The contracts are secret. If you trade a barrel of oil for a metre of road, how do you know the price? Is the oil valued at $100 or $50? Is the road valued at $1 million per kilometre or $5 million? Nobody knows. It is a black box. And inside that black box, billions of dollars of value can disappear. Critics argue that Angola overpaid massively for its infrastructure. They mortgaged their oil future for shiny buildings that started cracking 5 years later. And then there is the labour issue. When the World Bank funds a project, they usually require you to hire locals. It's part of capacity building. When China funds a project, often the contract stipulates that the construction must be done by a Chinese company. And that company often brings its own workers. We've all seen the images, a massive construction site in Kenya or Ethiopia, and the guys driving the trucks, pouring the concrete, and even directing traffic are Chinese nationals. The local Africans are left watching from behind the fence, or doing the lowest paid manual labour. It creates a situation where the GDP goes up, the debt goes up, but employment stays flat. It's growth without jobs. But let's address the big scary monster, asset seizure. The West loves to tell the story of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka couldn't pay its debt, so China seized the port on a 99-year lease. See, the West screams, they are coming for your land. In Africa, however, this hasn't really happened yet. China isn't typically seizing airports. What they are seizing is cash flow. In Kenya, the massive standard gauge railway, SGR, a $4.7 billion project funded by China, is losing money. It's a classic white elephant, or maybe a white panda. Because Kenya put up the revenue of its profitable Mombasa port as collateral, there is a fear that China controls the port's income. They aren't flying a Chinese flag over the port, but they are drinking the milkshake. The real danger of Chinese lending isn't a Bond villain plot to take over the world. It's much more boring and dangerous. Hidden debt. China doesn't report its loans to the traditional databases like the Paris Club. So, when the IMF looks at Zambia's books, they might see $10 billion of debt. But secretly, there might be another $5 billion owed to various Chinese state banks and companies. This is the iceberg problem. When the ship hits the iceberg, default. The damage is way worse than expected because half the debt was underwater, invisible. This makes fixing the problem impossible. Western creditors say, we won't offer debt relief if the money is just going to flow to China to pay off secret loans. And China says, we aren't a member of your club, we deal with Zambia one-on-one. Zambia is currently stuck in this geopolitical staring contest. They defaulted in 2020. They need a bailout. But the West and China are fighting over who takes the haircut, the loss. While the elephants fight the grass, Zambia suffers. However, we have to be fair. Why do African leaders love China? Because China treats them like adults. When Xi Jinping comes to Africa, he rolls out the red carpet. He shakes hands. He talks about win-win and South-South cooperation. He doesn't lecture them on gay rights, which is a sensitive topic in many African nations. He doesn't lecture them on corruption. He says, you want a bridge? We build bridges? Let's sign. To an African leader tired of being treated like a naughty child by the IMF, this is incredibly refreshing. And let's be honest, the West's criticism reeks of hypocrisy. The US complains about predatory lending. Have they met Wall Street? The US complains about China supporting dictators. Have they met their own history in Zaire, Egypt and Uganda? The African attitude is often, we know China is using us, but the West used us for 400 years and gave us nothing. At least China gave us a railway. But there is a subtle shift happening. The honeymoon phase is ending. African nations are realizing that Chinese banks are, surprisingly, banks. They want their money back. As African economies crash post-COVID, China is turning off the tap. Lending has plummeted, and Chinese negotiators are proving to be just as tough as the IMF when it comes to collecting. There was a moment in Uganda recently regarding the Entebbe airport expansion. A clause in the contract required Uganda to waive sovereign immunity for the airport's assets in arbitration. The Ugandan public panicked. They are taking the airport. China denied it, but the clause was there. It showed that the brotherly love of South-South cooperation ends where the balance sheet begins. So, is China the alternative? No, it's just a different flavour of the same poison. The Western debt trap is built on policy control and perpetual interest. The Chinese debt trap is built on resource extraction and opaque contracts. One wants your soul, the other wants your copper. Neither wants you to be free. But the West, realizing it was losing the game, decided it needed to rebrand. They couldn't just keep doing structural adjustment. It had a bad reputation, so in the 2000s they came up with a new marketing strategy. They stopped calling them orders, they started calling them strategies, and they invited the victims to write the ransom note themselves. Welcome to the era of the PRSP, the greatest rebranding exercise in economic history. 14. The Reform Ruse, New names, same game. If there is one thing the World Bank is better at than banking, it is marketing. By the late 1990s, the brand was toxic. The term Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, had become a dirty word. In Africa, if you said SAP, people didn't think of tree sap. They thought of hunger, riots, and closed schools. There were massive protests. The Jubilee 2000 movement was gathering steam, with everyone from the Pope to Bono screaming that the debt needed to be cancelled. The World Bank realised they had a PR disaster on their hands. They looked like the Death Star. So did they change their policies? Did they say, wow, maybe forcing poor people to pay for healthcare was a bad idea? No, they called the branding department. We need a new name, they said. Something that sounds nice, something soft, something participatory. And thus the Poverty Reduction Strategy Paper, PRSP, was born. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Here was the pitch. We aren't going to dictate terms to you anymore, the World Bank told African leaders. The era of the SAP is over. Now you are in the driver's seat. We want you to write the plan. You consult your people, you tell us how you want to fix your economy, and we will support you. We call it country ownership. It sounded beautiful. It sounded democratic. It was also a complete trap. Here is how the PRSP scam worked in reality. Imagine you are a teenager asking your strict dad for the car keys. Dad says, I won't tell you what to do. You write me an essay on where you plan to go. If I like it, you get the keys. You write, I'm going to go to a rave, drink beer and drive fast. Dad reads it. He doesn't say no. He just smiles and says, that's an interesting draft. Why don't you try again? Maybe think about the library. You rewrite it. I'm going to the movies. Dad says, getting warmer. But I feel like church is the word we are looking for. Eventually you hand him a paper that says, I am going to church, I will drive 20 mama, and I will be home by 8 p.m. Dad beams. Excellent. This is your plan. I fully support your decision to go to church. That is exactly what happened with the PRSPs. African finance ministers sat down to write their sovereign strategies. But they knew the answer key. They knew that if they wrote, we're going to subsidize farmers, tax foreign mining companies, and rebuild state industries, the World Bank would politely reject the paper. Technical deficiencies, they would call it. But if they wrote, we will liberalize trade, privatize utilities, and cut corporate taxes, the World Bank would stamp it approved. Studies done by NGOs in the early 2000s found something hilarious and terrifying. The unique, homegrown strategies of countries as different as Senegal, Nicaragua, and Vietnam were almost identical. They all had the same chapters. They all had the same economic logic. It was as if they had all copied off. The same nerd in class. And that nerd was the IMF. The genius of this rebrand was that it shifted the blame. In the 80s, when prices went up, people marched on the World Bank office. They burned the American flag. They knew who the enemy was. But under the PRSP, when prices went up, the World Bank could say, hey, don't look at us. This is your government's plan. It's right here in the paper they wrote. We are just partners. It neutralized the opposition. How do you protest against poverty reduction? Who is pro-poverty? This rebranding cycle happens every decade or so. First, it was structural adjustment. Then it was PRSP. Then it became Development Policy Operations, DPO. Now they talk about maximizing finance for development, MFDT. The acronyms change. The jargon gets more woke. They talk about gender, climate, and inclusion. But the underlying plumbing, the conditionalities, remains exactly the same. Let's look at a modern example. Rwanda and the Doing Business Index. For years, the World Bank published a ranking called the Doing Business Report. It ranked countries on how easy it was to run a private company. African nations became obsessed with this ranking. It was the only way to get investment. We need to move up the list, presidents would shout. How do you move up the list? You cut taxes, you slash regulations, you make it easier to fire workers. Rwanda became the star reformer. They shot up the rankings. The World Bank cheered. Look at the miracle. But then, in 2021, a scandal broke. It turned out the data was being manipulated. World Bank staff had been pressured to massage the numbers to make certain countries, like China and Saudi Arabia, look better. The World Bank was so embarrassed they cancelled the entire report. It didn't exist anymore, but the damage was done. For 15 years, African laws had been rewritten to satisfy an algorithm that was rigged from the start. Labour protections were stripped away because the index said they were inefficient. The scorecard was fake. but the poverty it created was real. This reform ruse extends to the very people who work there. The World Bank and IMF love to hire the best and brightest from Africa. If you are a brilliant economist in Ghana or Nigeria, your dream isn't to work for the Ministry of Finance, it's to work for the bank. The pay is tax-free, you get a diplomatic passport, you fly business class, you become part of the international civil service. This creates a brain drain of the policy elite. The people who should be designing an alternative economic path for Africa are instead hired by Washington to enforce the existing one. They become the gatekeepers. When they eventually go back home to become finance ministers or central bank governors, which happens constantly, they don't think like revolutionaries. They think like World Bank employees. They speak the language. They know the handshake. They are safe hands. There is a psychological term for this: capture. The World Bank doesn't just capture the economy, it captures the mindset of the ruling class. It makes it impossible for them to imagine a world without the World Bank. I want to tell you a quick story about Malawi and the famine that wasn't. In 2001, the IMF and World Bank advised Malawi to sell its grain reserves. It's inefficient to store all this maize, they said. It costs money, sell it. If you need food later, you can buy it on the global market. The logic of the spreadsheet. Malawi followed the advice. They sold the grain to pay off some debts. Then, the rains failed. There was a harvest shock. Malawi needed food. But the price of maize on the global market had spiked. Market forces. Malawi couldn't afford to buy it back. The result? A famine. Hundreds of people died. The president of Malawi later said, "We were forced to sell the maize to pay debts." The IMF denied they forced them. They said it was advice. That is the reform ruse in a nutshell. We just gave advice. You took it. The fact that we hold the power of life and death over your economy is irrelevant. Today, the new frontier of the ruse is financialization. The World Bank is now pushing for the Wall Street consensus. They want to turn everything in Africa into an asset class that can be traded by hedge funds. Toll roads, water systems, hospitals. They call it de-risking. Basically, the public takes the risk and the private investor gets the profit. If a toll road makes money, the investor keeps it. If the toll road loses money, the government guarantees a minimum payment. It is the privatization of profit and the socialization of loss. And they sell it under the banner of Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. We need trillions to save the planet, they say. Only the private sector has trillions, so we must make Africa safe for BlackRock. It sounds plausible. Until you realize that making it safe for BlackRock usually means making it dangerous for the poor. It means guarantees that lock governments into payments for 30 years. It means user fees that we know, from Section 4, kill people. So, the names change. SAPs became PRSPs. Privatization became public-private partnerships, PPPs. Austerity became fiscal consolidation. But for the woman in the market in Lagos, or the farmer in Zambia, the reality is the same. The price of bread is high, the clinic is expensive, and the government says, "Sorry, our hands are tied." But what if they untied their hands? What if they just said, "No"? Is it possible to escape the trap, or is the only way out to burn the whole prison down? In our final chapter, we are going to look at the exit strategy. We will look at the radicals, the rebels, and the crazy idea that maybe, just maybe, Africa doesn't owe the world anything. Maybe the world owes Africa. 15. Breaking the chains. Is sovereignty possible? So here we are. We have waded through the mud of history. We have seen the rigged contracts, the white elephants, the starving farmers, and the smiling bankers. It's a depressing picture. It feels like the trap is inescapable. Like Africa is in a financial Saw movie where the only way to survive is to cut off your own limb, and even then the door is locked. But is it? Is there a way out? Or is the destiny of the continent to be the eternal debtor? To find the answer, we have to travel back to July 1987. Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, an Organization of African Unity summit. A young man in a military beret takes the stage. He's the president of Burkina Faso. His name is Thomas Sankara. He delivers a speech that should be taught in every economics class in the world. He looks at the other African leaders, many of them dictators fat on World Bank loans, and he says, "Debt is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa. It is a reconquest that turns each one of us into a financial slave," and then he drops the hammer. "If we don't pay, our lenders will not die. That is for sure. But if we pay, we will die. That is also for sure. Sankara proposed a radical solution, a united front. He argued that if one country defaults, the West will crush them. They will sanction them, starve them, and assassinate their leader. But if all of Africa refuses to pay at the same time, if 54 nations stand up and say, the debt is illegitimate, we aren't paying, what can the World Bank do? They can't sanction an entire continent. They can't invade everywhere at once. The global financial system would panic. The power dynamic would shift instantly. We must form a cartel of debtors, Sankara argued. 3 months later, Thomas Sankara was assassinated, shot dead in a coup supported by Western interests. The message was clear: don't touch the debt. But ideas are bulletproof, and today the ghost of Sankara is haunting the halls of the IMF. So, what are the practical solutions for breaking the chains in the 21st century? Solution 1. The debt jubilee. Total cancellation. This isn't charity, it's justice. We need a global recognition that the debt has already been paid in cheap resources, paid in stolen labour, paid in interest rates that would make a mafia loan shark blush. Civil society groups are pushing for a comprehensive audit. Show us the receipts. If a loan was given to a dictator, cancel it. If a loan was for a failed project managed by Western contractors, cancel it. If a loan has been paid back 3 times over in interest, cancel it. Solution 2. Intra-African trade, AfCFTA. Remember how the railways were built to take things out of Africa? The African Continental Free Trade Area is trying to change that. The goal is simple: stop trading with Europe and start trading with each other. Why should Ghana buy processed chocolate from Belgium? Buy it from a factory in Ivory Coast. Why should Nigeria buy refined oil from the Netherlands? Buy it from a refinery in Angola. If Africa creates its own internal market, it breaks the dependency on foreign currency. You don't need US dollars to trade with your neighbour if you set up a payment system, like the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, that allows you to trade in local currencies. It de-dollarizes the economy, and that terrifies the West. Solution 3. Alternative architectures. The World Bank and IMF are no longer the only game in town. We talked about China, but there is also the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank. While not perfect, it offers loans with fewer political strings attached. It allows for lending in local currencies. It creates competition. When the World Bank knows you have another option, they suddenly become a lot more polite. Oh, you don't like our conditionalities? Let's negotiate. Leverages everything. Solution 4. Value addition. Resource nationalism. This is the hard one. It requires brave leadership. It means banning the export of raw materials. You want our lithium for your electric car batteries? Fine, build the battery factory here. You want our cocoa? Fine, process the chocolate here. Indonesia did this with nickel. They banned raw exports. The EU sued them. Indonesia stood firm. And guess what? Companies are now building factories in Indonesia. It works, but you have to be willing to take the heat. Solution 5. Restitution and reparations. This is the long game. The West owes Africa, not just for the debt, but for colonialism, for slavery, and for the climate crisis. The check for climate. Reparations, loss and damage, isn't aid. It's a bill. If Africa unites and demands this not as a plea for help, but as a legal obligation, the narrative flips. The World Bank was designed to keep the Global South in a state of suspended development. Developed enough to extract resources, but not developed enough to compete. Breaking that trap requires more than just economic policy. It requires a psychological break. It requires realizing that the experts in Washington don't know more than the farmers in the Rift Valley. It requires realizing that poverty is not natural. It is not an accident of geography or culture. Poverty is created. It is engineered. And if it was engineered, it can be dismantled. The World Bank has a nice motto written in the lobby of its headquarters: working for a world free of poverty. It's a beautiful slogan. But after 80 years and billions of dollars and millions of lives, we have to ask, who are they really working for? The answer is in the ledger. Follow the money. It doesn't lead to the village. It leads to the vault. So what have we learned today? We've learned that the aid industry is often a subsidy for Western corporations. We've learned that structural adjustment was a polite term for destroying the social safety net. We've learned that you are likely paying for the debt of dictators who are long dead. And we've learned that the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was designed to work. The World Bank is a debt trap. It is a golden cage. It provides just enough sustenance to keep the prisoner alive, but never enough key to open the door. But here is the thing about traps. They only work if you don't see them. Once you see the mechanism, once you understand the trigger, you can step around it. You can dismantle it. Africa doesn't need charity. It doesn't need another Bono concert. It doesn't need a poverty reduction strategy paper written by a guy named Chad in DC. Africa needs justice. It needs fair trade. It needs to be allowed to protect its own industries, feed its own people and manage its own money. It needs the boot off its neck. This isn't just African history, this is world history. Because the wealth in your pocket, the phone in your hand and the coffee in your cup are all tied to this system. We are all part of the chain. If this video made you angry, good. Anger is energy. If it made you rethink what you knew about development, even better. Do me a favour. Don't just watch this and move on to a cat video. Share this. Talk about it. Because the bankers rely on our silence. They rely on the fact that finance is boring and complicated. It's not boring. It's life and death. If you want to see more deep dives into the dark corners of the global economy, the stuff they definitely don't teach you in school, hit that subscribe button. And tell me in the comments, do you think African nations should form a debtors cartel and refuse to pay? Or is there another way out? I want to read your theories. Thanks for watching. Stay critical, stay curious, and remember, if someone throws you an anchor when you're drowning, check if it's attached to a chain. I'll see you in the next one.